Done! Well, Matthew, that was a productive round of development since our last devlogs. I think it's time to let our followers know how productive we were, so let's start on our devlogs. Tears of the Kingdom just released. I think we do deserve some time to unwind and see what we can learn from the Grandmasters at Nintendo. Well, it turns out there's so much content in that game we'll be here forever dissecting everything. Now, it's time to crack down on our devlogs and... I see. Let me prepare a demo build of what we have so far. After Tectoria, though, we'll have to start on our devlogs. I'll show you, Ianthe! I may be underleveled, but I'll take my spot as one of your rangers fair and square! Oh, you can go ahead, Matthew. I'll be studying other indie games. Okay, I think that's enough time wasted. We needed to get cracking yesterday. Matthew, why do you look so ghastly? Oh. Let me put it to you this way. I ended off my last devlog by saying that there were 3 things I wanted to get accomplished. 1, get the dungeon to randomize at start. 2, hook up the UI so that it's functional. And 3, replace the placeholder font with something readable. If you've read Matthew's devlog, you will have already seen that the placeholder text has been replaced with something more legible. If you haven't yet, you can find the link to his devlog below, either in the video description on YouTube or in the link below if you're watching this video embedded on the Studio Super Nebula website. Unless this video has been embedded somewhere else, like on Discord or Twitter or wherever, then I'll just leave the detective work to you. Wait, what do you mean it's not Twitter anymore? What is it called then? Oh. You know, I may be an edgelord in my own right, but I have a feeling I can easily kick the ass of whoever killed the Twitter bird for this bullshit! I should note that while I'm not a stranger to how YouTube works, I would never consider myself a YouTuber, much less an... influencer. But, alas, since I am responsible for marketing Rogue Proxy, I will need to encourage engagement somehow, but I'd like to do so in a way that respects everyone's intelligence. As such, I've decided to introduce a new segment, Viewer Shoutouts, where I will take a moment to share some of your thoughts, answer your questions, and take some time to consider ideas all of you might like to see implemented in Rogue Proxy. With this devlog, I'd like to give a shoutout to Isaiah Games for suggesting to allow for dynamic screen sizes and various aspect ratios as early as possible. That is sound advice given that even among PC setups, not every player is going to play the game with a 16:9 aspect ratio. There is one problem, however. In my experiments to try and make adaptable aspect ratio work for Rogue Proxy, I've never been able to get successful results. At least, nothing that looks good. The idea itself is good, however, so I'll pin the idea to the player request column on the Rogue Proxy Trello board. I can't guarantee we will get to it, but if we do make it happen, you'll know about it soon enough. I don't want to say too much about the process of creating some of the new UI elements since Matthew has already touched on it in his devlog, but I'm still going to do so anyway. First off, we have the notification panel, where the player will get updates on the action as it happens. The snowflake doily thing is going to be the indicator showing how likely the next enemy encounter will be. It doesn't do anything yet, but when it's hooked up, it will ripple colors indicating the likelihood of the next encounter, similar to what Shin Megami Tensei does. During cutscenes, however, the icon will be replaced with a portrait of a character who is talking. We'll get that working when we implement the dialogue system later. Next is the party status panel, which has been neatly organized into boxes that shows each party member's name, health points, tech points, and current status. We're using the green power switch symbol as a default icon for party members in good condition, but we do plan on having the color change depending on the overall status of each party member. That, and it will occasionally flash images of any pertinent status ailments, which we'll discuss in a future devlog. Lastly, we have the navigation panel. Here, it shows which floor the player is on, which direction they're facing, the percentage of the area explored, and a mini-map of the immediate area. Where Matthew is pleased with himself over making the percentage turn green at 100%, I am most pleased with the work put into making the mini-map, well, work. Basically, I followed Bracky's tutorial for making a minimap, but in earnest. I also threw in a rule for allowing the map to rotate around the player or not, should the player want to change their minimap to be whichever way they want. The genius idea I had, however, is this fog of war system where you don't get to see the full dungeon until you've explored the entire area. And so, this is the fruit of my labor. The most critical part of any roguelite game is for the dungeon to randomly generate upon starting the level. The good news is, Dungeon already has this kind of functionality built in. Now when I press play, an entirely new dungeon will generate. The unfortunate side effect is that because the player is only at the center of the dungeon and only faces north, the player may start out looking at a wall. This problem will most likely be solved when I figure out how to set up the start and end points of a dungeon, which shouldn't be too difficult if I take the time to read through the documentation. There. And now that I have recorded my update on how things are going on my end, I just have to edit all together and... I hate my f***ing life! I hate myself so much! Why the f*** did I do all this? So, back in September 2023, Unity made some decisions about how they were going to make money as a company. Decisions that put into question what the company's idea of ethical and legal dealings mean. Decisions that, even to this day, they still haven't fully made up for. The whole Unity pricing model debacle was a huge mess involving cartoonishly evil grade that upset a lot of developers, including us here at Studio Supernebula. And while Unity has tried to make amends to everyone who used their software, a lot of developers have simply lost faith that the company will stick to their word as a decent business, including us here at Studio Supernebula. Like other independent developers, we were at a crossroad about the development of Rogue Proxy going forward. But if you have read our public statement, you already know where we decided to go. Dough. Matthew and I ultimately decided upon Godot?
I am Godot, legendary prosecutor. I've never lost a case.
What kind of cases have you dealt with so far?
None.
Just who is this masked man?
Well then, Prosecutor Gobo?
It's not Gobo, Your Honor. It's Godot, Your Honor.
Matthew and I ultimately decided upon Godot as our engine of choice for a few reasons. The first is that it's free and open source, meaning that we are not beholden to pay fees of any kind, which is great for those of us who are building a game on a shoestring budget. Of course, if we were lucky enough to be an overnight success, we would be more than happy to donate a portion of our earnings to the Godot Foundation to help make the engine better. Second, it is capable of 3D graphics that are just right for our needs. Sure, Unreal looks fantastic and our computers are more than powerful enough to work with it, but keep in mind that we are making a game reminiscent of retro dungeon crawlers, so we don't have any need for things like Lumen. Besides, have you seen how gorgeous Road to Vostok looks? That has recently been ported into Godot. Third, we can still program our game in C#, which is a really nice feature to have, as I will explain soon enough. You might be asking, why not learn to use GDScript like everyone else who switches to Godot? In short, it's our personal preference to stick with and eventually master C# rather than have-assing yet another new programming language we have to learn from scratch. To paraphrase Bruce Lee, it's better to practice one kick 1,000 times than to practice 1,000 kicks one time each. That, and Godot's official documentation has examples in C# strewn everywhere, and you have YouTubers like Ina Peshot who teach how to use Godot with C# in an approachable manner reminiscent of Bracky's. So with our engine chosen to port our progress over, it would be smooth sailing from there, right? Well, when one Lengyetsky said that Godot is its own engine with its own workflow, he's not lying. To start, the interface is somewhat reminiscent of Unity's, so already there is some ease in use transferring from one piece of software to another. In time, however, subtle differences creep in that take some getting used to. For example, every node in the scene tree is only allowed one script each, which is fine if you're working on an individual prefab which can have multiple components. Sorry, did I say prefab? I mean scene, where a scene is a standalone object that can be used or manipulated within a scene, which itself is the equivalent to a scene in Unity, meaning that in theory you could have whole scenes nestled inside other scenes which contain smaller scenes and, maybe it's easier to show this chart. Once you wrap your head around how nodes and scenes work, it eventually becomes second nature. But then there are usability differences from Unity when working with Godot. For example, you know how in Unity the 2D and 3D axes look like these? In Godot, the y-axis points down instead of up, and the z-axis points backwards instead of forwards. There's also how rotation values turn objects in different directions depending on if the values are positive or negative, which threw me into a loop, no pun intended, the first time I got mazes to generate. All of these things take practice. But then there are things that complicated our work more than it had to. Matthew and I picked our biggest pet peeves with working with Godot with the hope that someone working on the engine would listen and take our feedback into consideration. This will get technical, so skip to the next section if you're not into graphic design or software architecture. Matthew's pet peeve is how feature-poor text stylization is, especially with themes and labels. As nice as working with themes is, each theme only allows for one kind of font per theme. General convention in graphic design is that outside of the title of the work and the backside of any given Prince album, there are usually two fonts in use, one for the header and one for regular text. While it is possible to work around it and create headers as overrides, functionality to manipulate and style text in labels seems to be missing, outside of maybe 3 different ways to change the font size. Yes, there is functionality to fake bolding or italicizing fonts, but outside of rich text labels, which itself is only useful for dialogue and not basic labels, there is no way to underline text. These kinds of tools are standard in a variety of programs that make use of text for graphical design, and not just in word processors. Even Krita, which is also open source, offers this kind of functionality out of the box. As for me, my pet peeve is less about graphical design and more about keeping game architecture clean without having to follow Godot's functional idiosyncrasies. The best example I can give is how in Unity and Godot, there are different ways to create minimaps. In Unity, the best way you can make a minimap is to make a camera project whatever it sees onto a render texture, then apply that render texture to a raw image, and stick that raw image onto the canvas. The best thing about it is that the camera can stay attached or close to the player without much of a fuss, and the UI elements can be bundled together as their own thing. In Godot, to create a minimap, you first need to get a sub-viewport container and stuff it with a sub-viewport. This is the kind of thing that you learn to expect from Godot. But here's the crazy part. In order to get the sub-viewport to display what the camera sees, you need to attach the camera as a child of that sub-viewport. The sub-viewport only works if there is a camera as a child. This is most egregious if it's a camera 3D, which behaves like a 3D object. Why would I want to put a 3D object onto what is supposed to be UI? Now I have to add some code to a script to keep track of both the camera and the player so that the camera follows the player. And you know how I made the player's camera project onto an image which I can then use to be part of the UI in Unity? Surprise! I had to place the player's camera into a sub-viewport, which is a child of a UI element inside an otherwise 3D object in Godot. Maybe there is a better way to do this that I haven't figured out yet, but I want to keep all the UI stuff separated into a UI scene and the camera separated into 3D scenes. I mean, it all still works at the end of the day, but it's such a headache that doesn't help with modularity. On a positive note, we are thankful for the ability to program in C# and Godot, at least in the .NET version. While there are obviously a number of differences between Unity and Godot when writing in C#, and sometimes I have to do things the long way around compared to how GDScript would do things, I am thankful that there are numerous similarities between Unity and Godot that makes copying my original code over without hassle. Does something involve a vector 3D in my Unity script? I can still copy and paste all of that into a Godot script and it will still work just fine. Well, unless it involves rotation. I've learned that rotation by default is dealt with in radians, but I know how to use 2π radians to my advantage. Other than a few rough patches, porting from Unity to Godot is not as difficult as we expected. As for getting the Unity asset store tools into Godot, yeah, let's just forget about that. As viable as Godot is for Rogue Proxy, and as nice as it is that Godot is getting its own asset store soon, we currently cannot just buy or find a tool to solve some of our programming problems, which means no more grid controller and certainly no more dungeon. Everything from the code to the assets will have to be made from scratch. This is not much of a problem because that means all the code I write will be written in-house. And while I am not a genius programmer by any means, I know enough about the basics of programming to know what exactly I wrote and how everything works. With that, I started Rogue Proxy's codebase from scratch, and it was a trial in itself to get it to feature parity with our Unity prototype. To start, I had to put together a new random maze generator that will work with Godot. Prior to picking Dungeon, I had experimented with creating maze generators thanks to this course on Udemy. By the way, we're not sponsored, though we wish we were. As I mentioned previously, porting the C# code meant for Unity to Godot wasn't too difficult once I took Godot's API differences into account, and by extension, the direction of the Z-axis. Once I got the functionality to generate the dungeon at startup, the next step was to create a first-person controller for the player to explore the dungeon with. Outside of the aforementioned weirdness with putting UI nodes into a 3D object to create a proxy view viewport, assembling the first-person controller scene out of nodes wasn't too difficult. The tricky part was getting the code to move the player's proxy around. If you remember from my previous devlog, I was able to achieve rigid movement by making modifications to grid controller in order to get that retro feeling without going too far back into the past. In order to get that working in Godot, I had to reverse engineer how I wanted my movement script to work. Basically, I had to start from the ground up by making movements just happen, and that happens by changing the transform positions. Of course, it was rough, but it was a good base to modify into rigid movement, just like what I did with Grid Controller. There was a curious accident, though. In the Unity prototype, there was a bug where the player could enter multiple inputs at once. Now, however, we have the opposite problem. There are instances where the input would not feel as responsive as it could be, so I'll just leave that as a bug to deal with later. Of course, with all the maze pieces having walls and colliders on those walls, there's no point having the player move around if they can't move into the maze, is there? That was where I put the code in the maze generator that places the player inside the maze, but not just at the origin point of the scene or at any random part of the maze. I was able to get the player to spawn at a random dead end and make them face the direction they need to go. How's that for solving a problem I had before? Lastly, Matthew and I had to rebuild the UI. Aside from having to resize the UI assets to fit with our target screen size, blocking out where all the panels are supposed to go and where the text would be was moderately easy, though that's mostly thanks to how we had the Unity prototype for reference. Putting together the minimap and the exploration tracker was mostly similar in nature to the Unity prototype, just modified to make use of Godot's signal system to make the functionality more efficient. Before we knew it, though with the exception of a few minor differences and a few improvements, the Godot prototype for Rogue Proxy reached feature parity with the Unity prototype. While Matthew and I knew that Rogue Proxy was going to be a long-term endeavor, we were not expecting our original choice of game engine getting caught in a dumpster fire to be one of our obstacles. But that is part of the reality of being a software developer. Things can change in unexpected ways, and these challenge us to adapt. Given our success in our Godot prototype of Rogue Proxy, I think we have not only adapted, but also took control of our project. There is just something satisfying about building things from the ground up, like a well-deserved pride in a job well done. I, for one, am looking forward to what we will be up to next. To end this devlog off, I would like to give a couple of shoutouts. First, to Ruben Ronquillo, a game dev who also happens to be making a first-person dungeon crawler inspired by Megaten games. Ruben, if you're watching this, Matthew and I are really looking forward to seeing how the development of Project Insomnia progresses, and we wish you the best with navigating this, let's call it a conundrum, with Unity. Second, to ICI Games again for being among Rogue Proxy's first supporters. Please check out his channel and listen to his awesome music, including some songs that I collaborated with him on. With all that being said, and before I get back to work, I shall leave you with this. Good night, dear viewer. May you dream among the stars in the nebula.